Center, and we are thrilled to be presenting this timely webinar on ending homelessness and promoting racial equity through the human right to housing. What's happening on the Hill? This is sponsored by the AB section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, as well as another number of other ABA commissions and sections, and one of a series of rapid response webinars. There's a number of other webinars being actively planned on a number of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on those programs. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A function, not the chat function. So if you don't see those controls, make sure your screen isn't idle. They should be there on the side or the bottom of your screen, and we'll address questions at the end of the program. We'll also be sharing a recording of this program with everybody who has it, who's registered, so you can share it widely with your networks. And with that, we are thrilled to bring you today's program on ending homelessness and promoting racial equity through the human right to housing, what is happening on the Hill. Each year on one cold night in January, our nation counts more than 500,000 people experiencing homelessness, a number which HUD itself acknowledges is a significant undercount. That said, for the first time in 2020, and this was before the pandemic, we saw them finally count more than half of the individuals as unsheltered. And since the pandemic, it's only gotten worse. And I want to emphasize that while some folks might have a picture in their head of a stereotypical, scruffy, mentally ill, possibly addicted adult, the people I think of when I think of homelessness are children. School-age children make up a huge proportion of people experiencing homelessness in our country. More than 1.5 million were counted in the most recent count by the Department of Education. And there's many, many others, millions of others living doubled up, tripled up in short-term motels who may not be captured by HUD data. This is also, we know almost 1/3 of college students are housing insecure, and close to 1 in 10 are homeless. So these are numbers that are going up and have gone up every year since we've really started counting. And because homelessness disparately impacts communities of color, those with disabilities, and the LGBTQ community, and those communities are already subject to over-policing, unsheltered homelessness, and the criminalization of homelessness hurts those who are marginalized even more. And this is only getting worse with the disparate effects of the COVID pandemic. So we are likely to see a growth of unsheltered homelessness amongst people of color. And my concern here is that when communities see more people on the streets, particularly Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, there's more of a push to get them out of public view through criminalization. And that is why it's great that President Biden came in with a message that housing should be recognized as a basic human right, a right to which all Americans should be entitled. And he's making sure that those values are being put into practice in the drafting of new federal strategic plan to end homelessness by the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And it's the spirit that's motivating the historical investments in the housing in the Build Back Better Act, which I'm sure you're all interested to hear more about, and which we'll be hearing more about shortly. And we will hear from our all-star cast about that and much more today. With us, we have Representative Cori Bush, the representative for Missouri's 1st District, Sarah Sabian, the Vice President of Public Policy at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, Paul Bowden, Executive Director at the Western Regional Advocacy Project, and myself. And let me see. With that, I just want to make sure that Rep. Bush, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
Awesome, great. So to give us the view from the Hill, you may know her as the conscience of our nation, holding her fellow elected officials to account by courageously reliving her own trauma of her time in homelessness by sleeping on the streets of the steps of the Capitol in order to prevent that trauma from needlessly being visited on others, demanding and winning a temporary extension of the eviction moratorium this summer. But as she'll tell you, that's just the tip of the iceberg of her work on behalf of folks experiencing and at risk of homelessness. And because I know she won't object, I'll also say that while she's the face of work going on here, her staff are some of the hardest working folks on the Hill, and I'm giving a special shout out to her legislative aide, Kiara Davis, who always takes our calls and asks what she can do to help. But with that, I know she's very busy defending the right to housing on the Hill. So I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Representative Davis. Or sorry, Representative Bush.
No problem. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the American Bar Association for hosting this critically important webinar to end homelessness. This issue, just like you heard, is personal for me because I've been on the ground in St. Louis working with our unhoused community for years, and I know intimately something that we all know. We had a housing crisis and a crisis of the unhoused in our country even long before this pandemic. And since entering Congress in January, we have called for housing justice for all, particularly for our neighbors living unhoused. As winter closes in, freezing temperatures threaten the lives of every single unhoused person living without shelter. In the context of a pandemic, shelters, hotels, and other temporary housing settings can be deadly. Congregate housing increases the threat of contracting the virus. As we speak, tens of thousands of individuals and families are faced with the impossible choice of dying on the streets or dying in a shelter. The hypercriminalization of unhoused people means even if they choose the street, there's a strong probability they end up in an overcrowded jail. The stakes have never been higher. COVID-19 cases are at the same levels they were last year, but this time with limited federal protections in place. Unlike last year, there is no eviction moratorium. Expanded unemployment benefits have ended and stimulus checks have long been spent. I know what it's like to endure the violence of an eviction. I know what it's like to endure the trauma of being unhoused. That's why I camped out on the steps in August, demanding the eviction moratorium be reinstated. And for a month, it was, and it saved millions of lives. After the Supreme Court overturned it, and I immediately got to work with my team and Senator Warren, and we introduced the Keeping Renters Safe Act to enact an eviction moratorium to address the COVID-19 public health crisis. National advocates like my fellow panelists at the National Low Income Housing Coalition and the National Homeless Law Center overwhelmingly supported this effort because they know it will save lives. We know evictions further spread COVID-19 and result in loss of life. We must use data-driven legislative solutions to address this problem at its root. In my state, Missouri, Missouri has one of the highest rates of evictions in the entire country, with over 38,000 evictions filed since March 2020. March 2020. For the majority of the state, the federal eviction moratorium was the only thing keeping people in their homes. In addition to a moratorium, Congress must confront the structural issues prevalent within the Emergency Rental Assistance Program to distribute the remainder of the $46.5 billion to tenants and landlords in need. That's why I introduced the ERAP Improvement Act to vastly expand access to ERA funds in public schools, in libraries, housing authorities, and much more. It's why I continue to conduct oversight over the Treasury Department's dispersal of rental funds. While this impending housing crisis has been exacerbated by the pandemic, Decades of stagnant wages and soaring cost of goods and services have left millions unable to afford housing. There is not a single state or even congressional district with enough supply of affordable housing for low-income families. This is a crisis. We need substantial and historic investments in both our affordable and public housing stock, just like the investments outlined in the Build Back Better Act. The nearly $150 billion in housing investments will forever change how the federal government approaches housing policy. Policymakers, advocates, and community members alike agree we need to vastly improve our public housing sector, increase the affordable housing stock, and implement permanent eviction defense measures. We need to decriminalize our unhoused neighbors, provide no barriers to permanent supportive housing, and finally, end the housing crisis once and for all. These are policies that save lives. These are policies I will continue to push for until we guarantee housing, healthcare, and livable wages for all. Thank you again to the American Bar Association for inviting me to speak at this urgent and very timely webinar. Thank you for holding.
Thank you so much, Representative Bush. Unfortunately, she was unable to be on camera right now because she's in transit and is on her way to help defend the right to housing all over the country. So won't be able to stick around for the Q&A. But yeah, thank you so much for everything you're doing. We'll move on now to another all-star of our all-star cast. We are very lucky to have a few minutes of time from one of the hardest working housing advocates on the Hill, Sarah Sabian. If you've been paying attention to housing policy in the Build Back Better Act, and you like what you see, you can thank Sarah for much of it because she is the one who's hustling, making phone calls, doing quick analysis, drafting calls to action, and doing a bazillion webinars like these to help mobilize the field to get and keep our priorities in legislation that's moving on the Hill. Sarah can share where we are right now and where we hope to go and what you can do about it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you guys today. I want to just build on some of the comments that Representative Bush made earlier, and also to point out that she's amazingly humble in the role that she's been playing in drawing attention to housing resources and the need for more investments. So I just want to thank her, even though I think she's already dropped off the line here. But you know, a major focus that she has had in Congress has been helping people who are facing eviction during the pandemic. And certainly we've seen from the pandemic, it's really shown a light on just how broken our federal safety net programs are, including housing programs. And part of the reason why we saw so many people behind on their rent facing evictions is because we just don't have resources at the scale that's needed to solve the housing crisis. And we certainly don't have enough renter protections in place at the federal and state level. And so I want to frame a little bit about what's in the Build Back Better Act by starting with, well, what does our housing crisis look like? And why are these resources so critically needed? So if you think about the housing crisis, at least the way that we do, we think of two major causes of the housing crisis, two major reasons why we're seeing so many people who are struggling to pay their rent or experiencing homelessness. And the first one really is this growing structural mismatch between what people have in order to on hand to pay for housing and what their housing costs are. We put out an annual report every year. It's called the GAP report and the Out of Reach report. The Out of Reach report looks at how much a household would have to earn in order to afford a modest 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And what we found is that housing costs are just completely out of reach for not just the lowest income earners, seniors and people with disabilities and other households, but even the typical renter. So for example, you would need an average income of about $50,000 a year to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. And that, of course, is way above the incomes of many working families, many seniors, maybe many people with disabilities. And what we're finding is that these runaway costs and housing, costs and income levels just are continuing to grow disparate. Since 1960, renters' incomes have increased by about 5%, but housing costs have increased by 61%. So you can see that there's this fundamental breaking point here. And there is no place in America where a minimum wage worker working full-time can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. The other cause of the housing crisis is really stemming from a shortage of housing for people with the very lowest incomes, housing that's affordable to them. We have found through our research that there's a shortage of about 7 million homes for people with the lowest incomes. Put another way, that means that for every 10 extremely low-income households, there are fewer than 4 homes affordable and available to them. There's not a single state or congressional district where there's enough resources, not enough housing to meet that demand. And as a result, many households pay at least half of their income on rent, which puts them at increased risk, housing instability, evictions, and in worst cases, homelessness. But despite that great need and the very clear demonstrated need for federal assistance, what we've seen is that Congress has underfunded housing solutions for decades. And so only 1 in 4 households who are eligible for housing assistance get any sort of help. The other 3 and 4 are left to fend for themselves. And while they wait for assistance, often decades on wait lists, many are pushed into homelessness, institutionalization, or incarceration as society sort of deals with the impacts of homelessness and the housing crisis. Of course, in all of this, we know that people of color are most harmed by the housing crisis. Black renters, Native Americans, Latinos are much more likely to have an extremely low income, to pay more than half of their income on rent, to face evictions, to experience homelessness. And we also know that for them, it can be much more difficult to access the resources that are provided by Congress and the federal government. So I want to just share in the chat box for you a place where you can learn more about the underlying causes of the housing crisis and what the solutions are. So I'm sharing a link to both of our GAP report and our Out of Reach report. But when the National Low Income Housing Coalition was looking at this pandemic, looking at the housing crisis, looking at the failure of our housing safety net, we wanted to take a step back and think about, what do we really need here? How do we get to a place where every single person who needs housing assistance can get the help that they need? And how do we make sure that we're looking at the reforms that go along the resources with the resources to make sure that those funds are truly accessible to everybody, including people of color? So we've launched the House campaign, which is focused on both the large scale investments that we think are needed, but also the reforms that are needed as well. And we focus on 4 major solutions. We talk about bridging the gap between incomes and housing costs by expanding rental assistance to every eligible household, in line with what President Biden has called for. We are pushing for expanding and preserving the supply of housing for people with the lowest incomes. We want to see new tools put in place that can help households stabilize quickly when they face a financial crisis like a pandemic, but also a broken down car, a couple of missed days of work. And finally, we want to see more robust renter protections at the federal level, because we know that there's this power imbalance between renters and landlords that put renters at risk. So the Build Back Better Act we see as being the first and best opportunity for Congress to push forward with the House agenda. We know that we, our partners, our members have been spending the better part of a year really engaged with our members of Congress to push for robust but also targeted investments in the Build Back Better Act. And right now, we're really pleased to see what's in the bill. I'll give you a sense of what's in there and where things were. So right now, the bill includes about $154 billion in affordable housing investments. This would be a historic level of investment in housing that we haven't really seen in decades. And we see this as really the only opportunity in the foreseeable future for Congress to pass resources at this scale. That's because Democrats are using the budget reconciliation process that allows them to pass resources with just 50 votes in the Senate rather than the 60 votes that we typically see for other bills. That $154 billion is highly targeted to households with the greatest needs. So I'll focus on three priorities that we've been advocating for. First, the bill includes $25 billion to expand rental assistance. That would serve about 300,000 additional households who aren't currently being served. Those resources are targeted to extremely low-income households and also people experiencing homelessness. There is $65 billion to preserve public housing. 2.5 million residents currently live in public housing, and we've seen for decades, because of underinvestment by Congress, public housing is often in poor condition and needs to be preserved for the health and safety of current and future residents. And finally, there's $15 billion to build new homes for people with the lowest incomes through the National Housing Trust Fund. And we estimate that that would result in about 150,000 new homes being built. What's really critical here that I think is a big takeaway is that Congress is listening to advocates about not only the need for robust housing resources, but for those resources to really be targeted to people experiencing homelessness and those who have the greatest needs. So if you add up those three priorities that I mentioned before, all three of them are the three biggest line items in the housing bill, and they amount to about 2/3 of the total investment in housing resources. There are other dollars in there as well for energy efficiency and community development, tribal housing, rural housing, other resources that are out there. These three are the three primary vehicles that Congress is using right now to make to address the housing crisis. And we're really pleased to see that's really focused where it needs to be. But I will say that these investments are not guaranteed in a final bill. We've gone through a lot of ups and downs with the legislation. We started off with about twice the size of housing investments, and that's been scaled back significantly by 50%, as I mentioned, as negotiations continue with moderate senators like Senator Manchin and Sinema. But we're not anywhere close to having this bill enacted yet. We are hopefully going to see a vote in the House this week, but it is not a guarantee that that's going to happen or that there are enough votes to get it across the finish line, even in the House. Last time Speaker Pelosi aimed to bring the bill to the floor, we saw that she had to take it off the floor for a vote when moderates and centrist Democrats threatened to vote against it until there was some more information about what the total cost would be and the impact on the fiscal impact of the bill. We're hoping to see those moderates make good on their promise to vote for the bill now that those resources and those data points are more available, but it's unclear. And we know that even if it were to pass the House, we're going to still face really big challenges on the Senate side. We expect further changes to be made to the bill. Senator Manchin and Sinema have not yet publicly agreed to any top line amount for the bill. So we could see that top line number scaled back even more. We could even see threats as, there's been news reports about inflation, which is a major concern for Senator Manchin. We could see, we haven't seen yet, but we could see him use that as leverage to really scale down the bill even more significantly than it already has been, all of which would put housing investments at risk. So I want to share with you a resource in the chat box about, about the housing provisions that are in the Build Back Better Act. You can check that out later on. I also would want to invite you guys to engage with your members of Congress about why these resources are so needed. Democrats don't have a lot of wiggle room here. They need every single Democratic senator to vote for the package. They need all but 3 House members to do it as well. And that really means that if you have a Democratic member of Congress, there is a job for you to be engaging with them and educating them about why we need housing resources, why we need to end homelessness, and why these are the solutions to do it. So I want to share with you 2 ways that you can take action here. The first way is that you can join our House campaign by signing on to our national support letter. The letter is already signed by 1,800 organizations across the country. So we want to invite you guys to sign on if you haven't already. Share it with your networks, engage with others, and encourage them to sign on. But I also want to encourage you to think about becoming a member of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. The reason why all of us have been successful in getting these housing resources in the bill is because we've had a number of advocates across the country who have been very, very laser focused on making sure not only that we have housing resources, but we are prioritizing those who have the greatest needs, including people experiencing homelessness. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. And just making sure you're going to be able to stick around for Q&A. Okay, great. Because I do know that some questions were coming in the chat or in the Q&A. And if you, while you're off screen, if you can reload the links to the gap report and out of reach. Looks like the links didn't come through in the chat, so people were asking for those. All right, so I will go back to my fancy share screen and say, to round out our presenters for today, we have Paul Bowden, who's been leading the fight by, for, and of the people experiencing homelessness from the Western Regional Advocacy Project based out in San Francisco. Paul and RAP have some of the most sophisticated analysis of housing and homelessness policy out there, connecting the dots from Jim Crow criminalization of public space to federal affordable housing cutbacks in the 80s to the sweeps of homeless encampments today. The Law Center and RAP have gotten up to some good trouble in the years in between, and along with his analysis, Paul is going to share a little bit about one of our current collaborations just launching in a number of cities for legal defense clinics that should be of particular interest to ABA members. I feel lucky to call him an ally and a partner because I sure as hell wouldn't want to be on his enemies list. I give you Paul Bowden.
Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon, I guess, for most of you. Good morning here, but thanks for having me on this. And I just wanted to start off with the context behind creating the Western Regional Advocacy Project. And I just put our website in the chat area. Was a gathering of local groups in Skid Row and in Old Town in Portland, in San Francisco, Oakland, Sacramento. We're in a bunch of cities at this point that were really frustrated not seeing the realities that we face every day in our communities. I was homeless at the age of 16, and by the time I was 23, I hit the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco. And the racism and the inadequacy, not the inadequacy, the neoliberal approach to addressing poverty was blatantly obvious to so many of us. Like, just as Reagan came in and started these massive affordable housing cuts to public housing and to Section 8, project-based Section 8 programs, the same in rural communities with Section 515 housing programs. These were all wiped out as part of the Reagan Revolution, and instantly, within a year, people that would like Hospitality House in the Tenderloin would normally close at 10, 11 o'clock at night, and everybody would go home, and then they would come back the next day and they would hang out, they would use the arts program, they would do whatever they were doing in the community center, get their mail because they lived in SROs or they lived in buildings where getting your mail was always a challenge on check day. And at 11 o'clock when normally they would close from 1969 to 1982. In October of 82, they started closing their doors at night and people had nowhere to go and they became crash pads. And that's how long this recent incarnation of homelessness in the United States has been going on. And what have we seen in response to it? We've seen welfare reform in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. We saw Hope 6 under the Clinton administration, where hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing were torn down with no legal mandate to replace those units on a one-for-one basis. In fact, it was Senator Feinstein that introduced the legislation to relieve the federal government of the responsibility to replace units of publicly owned housing that HUD destroyed on a one-for-one basis. Where do we think people are going to go? Where do we feel like they're going to end up? If Julia Child was to write a recipe for how to create homelessness in America, that's pretty much how that recipe would have read. It was obvious and it was blatant. And what we've seen is homeless management information systems and 5-year plans and 10-year plans and chronic homeless plans and HUD VASH plans and coordinated intakes, as if we just rearrange the chairs at a certain level or a certain way, somehow the concrete causal effects of what created homelessness in the United States would suddenly disappear. Of course, we need the Build Back Better Act because we're talking about the equivalent of $54 billion a year of affordable housing funding that no longer exists. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing that no longer exist. So as we shrink the pie of access and our waiting list go from 15 years to 20 years, it wasn't like these units were sitting empty. It wasn't like there wasn't a demand for affordable housing prior to the Reagan Revolution. As we squeeze that pie, the racism and the approach to, well, if you're poor, you're dysfunctional, you need supportive housing, or you need a special intake system, or we need to be able to trace and manage and life skills train you back into fitting into a system that is racist at its core, and that sees poverty as dysfunctional human beings, and we should just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and fit back into a capitalist system that is killing us. And every time that we decrease or we reprioritize who gets access, we're not acknowledging the fact that residential treatment is what indigent poor people have needed for years in terms of getting treatment. Now, residential treatment is very accessible for the wealthy. It's only not accessible when it's not a commodity, when it's a public benefit. Housing, education, healthcare are good for everybody. The whole community benefits when everybody is well-educated, healthy, and well-housed. So those are public benefits. Those are benefits that enhance the living conditions for everybody in our society. But we don't see it as a priority at the federal government. We don't see it like we want to commodify the climate change aspects of the Build Back Better and make it so that there's a profit built in for corporations to do what they should be doing in the first place, which is not kill us with toxic waste. Like, just because something is a priority of our federal government, it is mandated that entity, that public park, those public sidewalks, business improvement districts, privatizing our public spaces in our downtown corridors to the benefit of the business community. Somehow that's all the rage at the local level now, and 70% of their money goes to private security. So the policing of our public spaces is now a private, corporate-driven, profit-incentivized entity. And that is gonna kill and hurt and disempower people of color. People, God forbid you're Black, mentally ill, and unhoused and big. and male in this society. Getting through an intake is not going to be the same like it was for me as a young white boy from Long Island. There are two separate realities, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to address these issues at their core. If we want to address homelessness, if we want to address the criminalization of people for sitting on a sidewalk, think about it. Who in this gathering has ever been approached by a private security or by a police officer for sitting on a sidewalk? It happens to unhoused community members, especially mentally ill and people of color community members. It happens to us all the time. Loitering, which has been on the books forever. None of these laws are new, by the way. These laws have been around since the Antioch days, since the sundown towns, since the Basurero Treaty, the Japanese American Exclusion Act. Our local governments have a long history of using time, place, and manner restrictions to remove unwanted community members from local communities. And that's where Eric talks about the legal defense clinics. I mean, if you're going to be criminalizing us, just organizing, as we learned with Hope 6, as we learned with welfare reform, you can't organize to fight back against oppressive policing practices or oppressive housing policies or oppressive welfare policies with just the organizing separate from fighting for the individuals that are being oppressed. And so the intent of the legal defense clinics is to bring the legal services into Skid Row, into Tenderloin, into Old Town, into our communities where these activities are actually happening to people, while we simultaneously organize to fight those oppressive laws. And the more we can build networks that connect the legal service skills with the organizing skills, with the art skills, with the music skills, with the housing development skills, the more we are brilliant, the more we are informed, the more diverse we are with our skill sets and with the color of our skin and with our backgrounds and our histories. There should be no separation when you're fighting a war to defend the rights of poor and unhoused community members, because it's going to take all of us to overturn this concept that, well, we can easily afford to do $140 billion a year in housing subsidies for home ownership through the IRS and through tax write-offs, but we can't afford to have $154 billion put into a 10-year housing strategy plan. The hell we can't. We choose not to afford it. We choose not to do these things. It's not that we can't do it. It's that we choose not to do it. And that's where we need to be more entitled in how we're approaching this stuff. We need to be more demanding in how we're putting our priorities and our goals and our objectives and our work, our day-to-day work, how we put that forward. Because this is not acceptable that 38 years after the advent of contemporary homelessness, certainly not homelessness, but 38 years after the advent of contemporary homelessness, COVID hits and the whole homeless delivery system absolutely falls apart. What it shows you is that that system wasn't set up to end homelessness. That system was set up to manage homeless people. And if we want to end homelessness, we need to have a system where housing really is a human right, and not just as a rhetoric or a tagline for politicians, but as a funding stream at HUD. You heard so much about housing first. You heard there was no HUD line item to fund the housing in the housing first component. So that tells you that it was a public relations campaign more so than it was a housing strategy. If we really want to get back to a place where we can actually address the class and race issues that led to this massive increase in homelessness that began in the 1980s, we need to actually get the housing piece of it funded and get people back into a decent place to live or back into a place to live. and actually make this an organizing campaign that says this isn't a come and go. You're not going to end homelessness for good without addressing the race and the class issues that created homelessness in the first place. So let's bring all of those campaigns together under one umbrella and share our skill sets, share our experiences, share our brilliance, and actually address the kind of change that needs to happen, and do it from an entitled position. We are human beings. We are entitled to a government that sees our housing, our healthcare, and our education as human rights. A living wage is a human right. It's not something that you're doing for us. It's not charity. It's making sure that we all are able to live in a society free from oppression, and in a way that our kids can grow up healthier and stronger than we are, and stop the generational downward trend of our current living status, and reverse that to an upgrade trend in how our generations are advancing forward and moving forward in this country. Thank you very much.
Whew. It's hot in here.
It's early here. I'm sorry. I'm just waking up.
No. I feel like I should be handing around the offering plate because we're definitely in church. Hallelujah. That was awesome, Paul. Thank you. So that yes, and I will say, you know, as Paul was saying towards the end, we do want to be talking about housing not just as a human right, as a slogan, but as a concrete deliverable for people, for the people in America. And I'll note that this is not just us crazy advocates saying this, but this is ABA endorsed all the way back in 2013. The ABA passed a resolution urging governments at the state, federal, local level to promote housing as a human right and to develop its implementation. So this is ABA policy that you all can use in your advocacy in your communities and in the ABA itself. And one of the reasons this is important is because the human rights framework is a really comprehensive framework that provides accountability for implementing the value. So you kind of have this broad slogan value that people are communicating now more than ever. You saw it with Representative Bush on the steps of the Capitol. You've seen it from coast to coast in people doing takeovers of housing with like the Moms for Housing out in Oakland, in people defending families from evictions. Housing as a human right has a rhetorical value to it because people understand that it's not charity, it's a right, it's something you don't ask for, it's something you demand, you have your rights ensured. But in addition to that rhetorical value, there's a really rich and comprehensive set of norms at the international level that have been developed over the past 40 or 50 years that are better than many of the rights that we have here in the US today. And we can use that international framework in order to scaffold ourselves up to some of these better protections. And that includes a right to substantive equality, not just about intentional discrimination, but about the impact of policies from long ago up through the present that result in inequity in our culture today, and a requirement to actually remedy those historical inequities, not just are you allowed to, but you're actually required to under the human rights framework. The right to housing, it's not just a right to shelter, it's a right to fully adequate housing, not just 4 walls and a roof around you, but housing that's affordable, habitable, accessible, culturally adequate, that you have protections to stay there, and that you have to make constant progress, progressively realizing the right over time. And as I said, there's all these 7 elements that are at the international level that really come together in a comprehensive way to ensure the right. So it's all of the problems we've been discussing so far: the encampments, the lack of rental protections, the lack of affordability, lack of habitability. All of those things need to come together in the right, and the framework gives us the ability to make sure that any policies that are being introduced are going to address all of those elements of the right in a comprehensive way. And we need to, the concept of progressive realization means that we start where we are. We acknowledge that we aren't perfect, that we haven't ensured this right, but that we need to make progress in a concrete way going forward. It doesn't mean everybody gets a set of keys to a single family home with a white picket fence tomorrow, but we need to make sure that we're moving forward towards the fully adequate right to housing in a way that's not taking us backwards, that's not reducing funding without saying, if you're going to reduce that funding, how are you going to make sure that the right continues to get enjoyed elsewhere? What regulations are you going to change? What incentives are you going to change to make sure that we continue to produce the kind of deeply affordable, fully adequate housing stock that we need going forward? And why is this important? Because when housing is viewed as a human right and put into law, then it can make real impact. In Scotland right now, if you become homeless and you present yourself to the local housing authority, there's a mandatory statutory duty for them to secure permanent accommodations for you within 90 days and provide you immediately with some sort of temporary housing in the interim. There's a very broad definition of what homelessness includes, and it makes sure that the housing that's being offered to you is suitable on physical, safety, mental health, all sorts of different ways. And because this duty is put onto local authorities, it incentivizes them to come up with means of preventing homelessness, including by creating more affordable housing so that they don't have this duty triggered for them. And there's a number of other provisions in the law to help put that in place. For example, the duty on landlords and banks to notify the government if somebody is in danger of losing their housing, so that the state can step in and prevent their homelessness rather than having to deal with it on the back end. And what's the result of that? We've seen a decrease in the number of people experiencing homelessness in Scotland. Same thing in Finland. In Finland, they have a different approach. There's a constitutional review committee that makes sure that their commitment to housing as a human right, which is in their constitution, is assessed in each piece of legislation that's being put forward, so that any legislation, before it even gets to the floor to be voted on, has been assessed. Is this moving us in the direction of progressive realization of the right, or is this taking us back from it? And if it's taking it back, then it has to be amended even before it's fully introduced into their parliament. And as a result of this, again, we've seen a dramatic decrease in homelessness in Finland. So these are the kinds of laws that we can put in place. Just because our system is the way it is right now doesn't mean that's the way it has to be. And so we know that these policies are out there, and there are steps that you as ABA members, as folks in the community, can take. And that includes endorsing the campaigns, as Sarah said earlier. We've got the House campaign, as well as the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign, You can endorse those. You can call your elected officials. Very important right now to get the word out to them about Build Back Better. Oops, we're going too fast. You can volunteer. Paul was mentioning we have legal defense clinics that are being set up in a number of communities across the country where lawyers and others can volunteer to take on cases of people being criminalized. You can volunteer to take on eviction cases. There's been a big call by Attorney General Garland as well as others for attorneys to get involved in eviction defense. And you can work to speak out in your community, call for the creation of right to counsel in eviction cases, which will be a huge step forward in preventing homelessness and has been in a number of communities across the country already. And speak out when there are laws being proposed to criminalize people experiencing homelessness. Say that this is not the way to end homelessness. It only prolongs it. It puts more barriers, arrests, records, and fines and fees in the way of getting people off the street. And the way, if we actually want to end homelessness, we need to actually provide housing. That's what's going to end homelessness. We need to speak out again, and then once that housing is approved, it needs to be sited somewhere. Nobody's going to want it in their backyard, but it needs to be located somewhere so that we can actually put these plans in place. We've seen billions of dollars flowing out of the federal government recently to put in place affordable housing in communities, to provide more vouchers, to buy hotels and turn them into low-income housing. And in many cases, there are voices, not in my backyard, advocates who are calling for those projects to be stopped. We need them more than ever. And so we need people speaking out in favor of these and saying, it's up to all of us to make a difference here. So with that, here's some contact information for the Law Center. Feel free to reach out. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. We can go to some of the questions. One of them, Sarah, I was going to ask you to take on. Somebody asked about source of income protections and the need to address that issue, adding source of income protections for people using vouchers and other things, because there's a lot of discrimination based on that. What's going on at the federal level to try to address that issue?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's certainly a much needed reform that, if we're really serious about having universal housing assistance, we'll need to think through how we can protect renters from discrimination, and including expanding the Fair Housing Act to include source of income. The challenge is that those sorts of reforms require 60 votes in the Senate, including 10 Republicans. So it's a place where we need more bipartisan engagement with members of Congress and building those bridges to explain why those resources are needed. In the past, we've seen Republicans take a lead on this. Then Senator Hatch of Utah, before he retired, led a bill. He introduced a bill that would ban source of income discrimination. But this year, it's really, I think, isn't top of mind. Nearly all of Congress's attention is on the Build Back Better Act. And because of the unique process Democrats are using, we really can't add the types of reforms like source of income discrimination bans like we would want to the Build Back Better Act. Build Back Better can only deal with spending or tax increases, not policy reforms. So that means that after this bill passes, there's a lot more work for all of us to do to make sure that we're passing source of income discrimination bans and other reforms that would make it easier for people to use resources. I'll also say that there are some other ideas that are out there being discussed that might help avoid the same sort of discrimination that we're seeing with the voucher program. So for example, when Vice President Harris was a senator, she introduced legislation to create a renter's tax credit. That's a proposal that would just give resources directly to renters. It would bypass the landlord, so to speak. That's something that we think could be administratively easier to implement than vouchers for everyone. And it also has the added benefit of preventing landlords from being the gatekeepers in terms of who can have access to housing assistance and who can't. So that's just one example of some, creative ideas that are being discussed. But yes, certainly we need source of income discrimination bans and other reforms too.
Right, and it was as you said, it's a hard battle to fight, but it is in legislation that's been introduced, like the Ending Homelessness Act and other bills on the Hill. So there's definitely an effort out there, but we need to draw attention to it and continue to educate Congress members, particularly Republican Congress members, about it.
I also think there's things outside of the legislative process that we could be much more proactive in addressing. I mean, all of the bar association members and stuff are in local communities and looking at the impact of homeless courts, like that. If you weren't criminalizing unhoused community members, you wouldn't need a homeless court. The court set up mental health courts and substance abuse courts and homeless courts because they were being inundated with criminalizing disabilities and substance use and housing status. I mean, we talked to over 1,700 unhoused community members, 82% harassed, cited, or arrested for sleeping, 77% for sitting on a sidewalk, 75% of the people we spoke to for standing still. They call it loitering. So you're inundating the criminal justice system, as they call it, with oppressive and racist and classist policing programs, and then you're setting up separate courts to stop the inundation of the court system. Like that's a place where at the local level or with business improvement districts, there's places at the local level while we're trying to get a federal government that might actually respect us as human beings. We shouldn't have to explain to the federal government that housing policies since forever, but since the 1980s, certainly, are the creation of what created homelessness. There's testimony after testimony from the Federal Register back in the 80s of the Congress and the Senate members saying the homeless bill at that time wasn't going to end homelessness, that we needed to restore the housing. You don't even hear that anymore. So it isn't just a matter of, well, let's see if we can convince the feds that we're actually talking about human beings here. Simultaneously, in your day-to-day work, you can be fighting for the rights of people to exist, because the reason they want us to disappear from public space is because then they've ended the problem. We don't see it anymore. It doesn't exist. Well, that's just not true. And we've got almost 40 years now of aggressive bulldozing and policing and taking people's stuff and throwing people's belongings away to try to make us disappear. And they forget that we're not lemmings and we ain't jumping off the side of the mountain. We're going to stay here and fight.
Nice. There's a number of other questions coming in the chat. One of them was about somebody who said that the ARPA, the rescue plan dollars were being used for encampment evictions, and how we can prevent those resources from being used to harm unhoused folks. I haven't myself heard specifically of those funds being used for evictions. I don't know if Sarah or Paul, you had, I know we tried to actually get protections into the bill to prevent that from happening, but those amendments didn't get passed. But yeah, I don't know.
I would love to invite the person who asked that question to reach out to us to share a little bit more details. The emergency rental assistance, the ARPA money, including emergency rental assistance, is really intended to prevent evictions and to assist households, including those experiencing homelessness. And so maybe with a little bit more details, we can go back with that organization to the Department of Treasury to report this, because I think that's very concerning if they're using the funds for this way. I'll share my contact information in the chat box.
And the only way it should be being used to address encampments is to get people out of encampments and into housing, which it can be used for. But you know, yeah, it shouldn't be being used to evict them without access to housing. Paul, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I mean, we saw these policies tend to be trends, and we saw a real uptick in your immigration status, your criminalization status, your history of criminalization. Like we see these upticks in screening tools that are used to reduce the number of people eligible for certainly housing, but for other services as well, so that we have less people on the waiting list because they didn't get turned away, they're just not eligible. And it makes perfect sense that those kind of policies trickle down to every new endeavor that does get created, because those become the standard policies. And I think we need to go back with a really sharp, critical lens in looking at the historical policies, not even being that old historical, and really work together to ensure that they stop trickling down to every new little program that gets created.
We got a question here. It says, I feel like true public housing is rarely discussed as compared to Section 8 or the tax credit program. What's the political climate for expanding federal or local PHA housing stock through new construction or acquisition? Sarah, you want to answer some of that?
That's a great question. I'm really glad somebody asked that. I think what we're seeing is the beginning of a new attitude towards public housing, but we're really at the very beginning processes. I think, the reason why we're seeing public housing in such states of disrepair is because Congress has underfunded public housing for decades. We've been losing housing stock through public housing for that reason. The Build Back Better Act does include, I mentioned, $65 billion, which is a huge investment, nearly enough to completely eliminate the backlog of capital needs in public housing. And there is currently a provision that would eliminate the Faircloth Amendment for those investments so that we no longer have a restriction on the number of public housing units that are available. But but there aren't resources to build beyond what we have in terms of public housing. I think part of the reason for that is there has just been a very over decades, we've seen a focus more on what the private sector can do with federal dollars, whether it's through the low-income housing tax credit, as they ask, or Section 8 vouchers. But as I mentioned, you see, especially among progressives, more of an openness towards new public housing. I think the real focus here is really on nonprofit-owned, community land-based owned, capitalistic models of having housing. And we do have resources that can lead to that sort of housing. It's just not specifically identified as that. So for example, the investments in the National Housing Trust Fund can be used by community land trusts. It can be used by local governments to create publicly owned or nonprofit owned affordable housing. But that's one use of it. It could also be used by for-profit developers to do the same sort of thing. So I think there's more of an appetite for that, but I think we have a lot of work ahead of us to educate members of Congress about why is it that we need more publicly owned affordable housing, and do we also need other things like renter protections that might be in place to guard against the power imbalances that exist when renters are living in housing from for-profit developers, et cetera. So there's a lot, I think, more work ahead of us on that, but I really appreciate the question.
And I would say, and there is Representative Omar was the lead author of it, but Blumenauer and AOC and I think Representative Bush were all signed on to the Homes for All Act a couple of years ago. That didn't even, to me, that was, and maybe I'm biased because Blumenauer was like holding our without housing report in his hand 14 years after we had put it out when they introduced the bill. But it was a really solid, let's get these resources back into permanent project-based Section 8 and a lot of public housing. Like Hope 6, we lost so many units, but not just we lost units. HUD was selling off properties left and right. We talk about fighting NIMBYism, and here we had the federal government owning property that could have been used to develop affordable housing, and the federal government was selling it as if they owned it, as if it wasn't public land, it was their land. So like to really reverse these trends, I think that we need to look more at bills like the Homes for All Act and less at these vouchers. To be a family on, I guess now it's TANF, right, of course, but a family on TANF, African-American with a couple of kids going around with a voucher trying to find a landlord that's not gonna hold your race and your economic status against you and want to deal with HUD's bureaucracy to get their 2/3 of their rent. That's a joke. That was done in Hope 6. You know, that's because it's cheaper to give somebody a voucher than to actually develop a unit of affordable housing. We need the units to be affordable and understand that people are going to come and go from those units, but the unit stays affordable for community members that need it. And we need to get that mindset and that philosophy back into the role of HUD in how they develop housing. Low-income housing tax credits, we're too poor to live in low-income housing tax credit programs. And we're seeing that more and more with the community land trust programs, where at the Homeless Coalition, we helped develop a local community land trust project that none of our people have ever been able to afford to live in, because that's the economic realities in San Francisco, not because they're assholes, but because that's the economic realities in San Francisco. And we need to address it.
I would love to build on that point, Paul, because I think that what gets lost in the conversation about social housing or public housing is exactly your point. What price point is it at? Who is it affordable to? Who has access to those units? I'll say, just from my perspective, that's a much more important question to me than what particular entity owns the property. Right. And so a lot of the things that we've been doing when talking to Omar, for example, Representative Omar or others, is that it's not enough to just stop at this is owned by community land trusts or by the local government. You still need to have the resources in place, the safeguards in place to make sure that we're not just seeing those entities discriminate against people who are experiencing homelessness, or we're not seeing them set rents at a level that's too high as well. So I really thank you for pointing that out, because it's sort of a nuanced part of the conversation that I think often gets lost.
Yeah, it's vital.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of questions here that are related. So, Paul, you mentioned, the mother going around with her voucher, not able to actually get into housing. Obviously, if you've got if you've got the units and you don't need the voucher, then you solve that problem. If you've got source of income protections, that helps, but then you need enforcement. You need testers going out. You need legal aid folks who are ready to and able to bring those cases. because we know that that kind of discrimination happens informally all the time, even if it's not their kind of stated reason for discrimination. Or you need things like the renter's tax credit or universal basic income, money that's just going into renters' pockets directly, and so there's no real opportunity for landlords to be discriminating on the basis of it. Are there anything else that either you want to say about like helping folks, I guess, other than avoiding the system altogether, but more assistance that could be provided for helping folks who do have vouchers actually get into housing and not lose them and end up back homeless again?
So I can start off by saying that obviously in the Build Back Better Act, we've talked about, we wanted to see an even more robust expansion of rental assistance, even though we knew that it is challenging for many families to use those vouchers or to find supply that's willing to take them. Part of the reason why we thought the Build Back Better Act is a good place to have that expansion is because the same bill includes, tens of billions of dollars to build supply. And when the federal government does build supply, they're required to accept vouchers. They're not allowed to discriminate. So there's some source of income discrimination protections included in that. But I will say that, and there's also money that can be used to help for recruiting landlords or addressing some of their concerns that they might have about, vacant units and the cost of that while they're waiting for PHAs to inspect the properties. There are things that HUD can be doing to streamline the program to make it more efficient. So there is less administrative burden on landlords as well. But it's also just a really important resource. I just want to underscore this, that in many communities, there isn't a supply problem. It's not the communities where we see a ton of unsheltered homelessness, but in much of the country, there is supply. It's just not affordable. And rental assistance is a really important tool to getting people into housing that they can afford. But I do think we're all correct in identifying many of the challenges here. And the reason why anytime we're going to a system where universally housing assistance is available, we also need to be looking at how do we construct from new, how do we reform, how do we streamline assistance so that we're not seeing so many barriers put in place.
And it's always struck me, having been homeless and now, believe it or not, a homeowner, like I never qualified for a subsidy till I became a homeowner. And then there was no waiting list. There was no criteria. Nobody looked at my background. Nobody counted toothbrushes in my house. All they did was say, are you paying a mortgage and a state and local property tax? Well, then you get your housing subsidy. It's administered by the IRS. You never hear debates in Congress about can we afford it or can't we afford it. It's $140 billion a year housing assistance program administered by the feds. But yet when we talk about the housing assistance programs for poor people, which is a much less amount of money, a much smaller amount of money, there's all these who's worthy, who isn't, how do we appease landlords? How do we make it so that people will house these folks? Like, it's an incredible dynamic to me that one is economic stimulus and everybody who's entitled to it gets it, no questions asked. And the other is screening, waiting list, intakes, and are you worthy? Like it's as classist as you could possibly be. And yet they're not equated as both being housing subsidies programs that are administered by the federal government. And that's where, it's the ABA, you should sue them. Like, that's where it just seems like there's got to be a way of actually addressing that blatant and obvious classism that exists in our housing programs administered by the feds.
Yeah, I love that, Paul. And I think you're seeing the same thing play out when it comes to emergency rental assistance to respond to the pandemic. When businesses were facing closure or they're at risk of firing employees, The federal government spent a ton of money on PPP loans. Those loans were distributed very, very quickly with very little oversight, very little paperwork for corporations to participate in. But when it comes to emergency rental assistance, even though Treasury has said to state and local programs that they need to expedite the funds to make it as easy as possible for renters and people experiencing homelessness to get these dollars, to have as few requirements as possible, you're still seeing state and local governments sort of get in their own way and put in place restrictions and paperwork and long applications and other barriers that are really slowing down their ability to serve people. And I think that goes directly to Paul's point, is that, when it comes to low income people, we're very skeptical and we want to make sure every single person is actually deserving, quote unquote, or making sure that no person who's ineligible gets through. But when it comes to businesses needing PPP loans, we feel like the more the merrier, get those dollars out quickly and have very little restrictions on it.
Yeah, and the the mortgage interest tax deduction, in addition to being classist, is also hugely disparately racially impacting. 90% going because you get it on your first $1 million or $750,000 of your first 2 homes, and so the wealthier you are, the bigger houses you buy, the more subsidy you get, and unsurprisingly, it's going 90% to white wealthy homeowners.
That's actually a place where we saw sort of unexpectedly Republicans in 2017, when they passed their giant tax bill, they actually took a swing at the mortgage interest deduction. They scaled it back. They had some reforms in there for the first time. It was very historic. It's just the second part that's needed. Once you reform the mortgage interest deduction, we also need those resources to be invested in housing for people with the lowest incomes and those who have the greatest needs. So we're halfway there with Republicans on the mortgage interest deduction, but not as far as we need to go.
And if we could get it where the waiting list is the same for both programs, I think that would be pretty freaking cool, because there is no waiting list on the homeowner housing subsidy program.
Yeah, and one of the other questions here is, what is the strategy to get Republicans, at least some, not just Democrats, to support housing as a right? And I think this is part of it, that they're having more of these conversations where we say, you're already giving these subsidies out. It's just a matter of who you're giving them to. And the more explicit we're able to make that, some folks may embrace that allocation, a racially biased allocation of funding, but I think many of them want to at least continue to portray themselves as colorblind and pushing towards a more democratic society. So I think despite the fears of people and talking explicitly about race, I think the more we do it, the more we bring these contradictions up, the more difficult it will be to maintain these clearly racially biased policies. So that's one strategy. And I think it's an area where the historical, where the Republican Party is today is not where they've been historically. And they may not go back ever in the direction where they once were, but there's a lot of history, like Section 8 was started under the Nixon administration, as a step back from public housing on the one hand, but still there's a Republican administration that still saw a role for the federal government in providing affordable housing, even if by a different mechanism. And in places like Scotland, where the the parliament there is, you know, a mix of liberal and conservative members, but there's a joint consensus by everybody that homelessness is wrong. You know, we had some folks visiting from the Netherlands a long time ago. They came over to look at housing first programs in the U.S. and they were saying, you know, so how is it that you deal with, you know, people living with addiction or chronically homeless individuals, you know, and getting them into housing. And, you know, so we were explaining things to them. And I said, well, and how is it that you deal with homeless families in the Netherlands? And they said, we don't let families become homeless. Yeah, like the where, you know, not all of the Republican Party, but at least the most vocal members of the Republican Party is just so far away from where it used to be within the Republican Party and where the rest of the world is. And I don't think a lot of Americans appreciate how far that is. But, you know, maybe we can get more conservative members from places abroad to say, you know, why they see housing as a right and, you know, where, you know, the business interest is in that. As Paul was saying, you know, housing is a public good because it makes, you know, public life better for everybody when everyone is adequately housed. So, you know, maybe that's the kind of messaging that we need to develop more of.
So I just want to build on that too. I mean, I think from my experience, it's important to talk about housing as a human right. It's important to point out the racial inequities in housing and in other sectors because those things are true, and we need to fix them. We have an obligation to fix them. But I will say that that language of housing as a human right is not one that is really likely to open the hearts of Republican members of Congress. We know that they tend not to use that humanistic framework, but that doesn't mean that we can't make progress with encouraging Republicans to support housing investments and other priorities. What I found is what tends to work best, or, you know, if you look at, for example, the housing bills that have been introduced by Republicans, like the Eviction Crisis Act was introduced by Senator Portman. You know, his focus in that bill is really on how do we ensure that everybody has economic opportunities. That's sort of his framework for understanding that bill. And so pointing out the connection between housing and the ability to hold down a job, housing and better healthcare outcomes, better educational outcomes for children, well, higher lifetime earnings for children who live in affordable housing, more access to opportunities to go to college and other things. You know, that might be the way that you convince a Republican to focus on the spending. I will say that there are a number of Republicans who just have no interest in spending at all. And so I don't think we're going to reach those folks. But there are a number of Republicans who care about housing as a platform for other goals, or they really care about ending homelessness and, you know, they see it in their communities and they want to do something about it. So there are some movements there. I do want to also say, like, on the Democratic side, it doesn't mean that things are a shoo-in either. You know, we do see Democrats talk more about housing, but and I will say thanks to the leadership of Maxine Waters, who's chair of the Financial Services Committee, people like Representative Bush, who was on the call earlier, and others, you know, they have a real focus on making sure that when we're talking about housing, we're talking about housing for people with the greatest needs. But there's a lot of education that needs to be done for a whole, you know, breadth of Democrats, and reorient them that we're not talking about housing necessarily for teachers and firefighters or people who make $80,000 a year. We really need to be focusing first on people who are unhoused and for people who have the greatest needs. And so there's a prioritization conversation that needs to happen with a lot of Democrats. So for all of you guys who are doing that sort of engagement, it's important to know that no matter where your members of Congress lie on the political spectrum, there's really important educational opportunities for you to be engaging with them and teaching them about what's needed.
We got about 5 minutes left. I see Paul wants to put in a response, but Paul, you can respond, and then any final comments if you have them, feel free to shoot them across now.
Okay. I mean, I just wanted to reiterate that a deep subsidy is not a bad thing. And I think that's been the crux here, especially with the low-income housing tax credit program and RAD and other endeavors that have taken place, is we can still say we're developing affordable housing, but we'll keep the subsidies really, really shallow so we can get more bang for the buck. And I think we need to start calling that out more. That the house, like when people are too poor to afford to live in affordable housing that's being developed with federal funding, then we got a serious problem in our housing programs. And we shouldn't be hesitant, or we shouldn't be reluctant to call that out, both locally, because local governments, I mean, hell, in San Francisco, they started using bus tickets as a housing placement. Oh, because of course they're going home and going to their home. That's BS. But that's how shallow we've gotten in our context of what constitutes housing, especially for unhoused community members. And I just think, I get called an a-hole all the time by politicians and stuff like that. But we'll be a lot nicer and a lot smilier when we start getting a lot more real about what we mean when we talk about housing for people in our community, because nothing ends homelessness like a home. And as
I love that, Paul. I 100% agree with you on that. And there's a question in the Q&A box about, well, why are we focusing on prioritizing people experiencing homelessness? Why aren't we also focused on workforce housing? And, it's a topic for another day. I know we're short on time, but I'm happy to talk about this with people offline. But, what we've found, at least, is that, very obviously people with the lowest incomes have the greatest needs. But also, the more you target resources to people who have the greatest needs, obviously it helps them, but it also helps people with relatively higher incomes. Nearly the entire shortage of housing, even in places like LA, San Francisco, New York City, Seattle, that shortage stems nearly entirely from people with the lowest incomes. And so if we're building housing with scarce resources at 80% of AMI, 100% of AMI, we're really not doing anything to tackle the underlying causes of the housing crisis. We're sort of just working at the surface level, helping with symptoms for some households. But if we were to serve people experiencing homelessness and those with the lowest incomes, we really would be helping everybody.
And then we go to community meetings at the local level all the time, and we get hit with these numbers. But San Francisco builds X number of units, or LA builds X number of units, and you try to get into the minutia at that point that, well, those aren't units that we can afford to live in. And it becomes like robbing Peter to pay Paul. Everybody that needs it should get it. It shouldn't be a trade-off of one on the other. I mean, hell, look at our military budget. We can afford this shit. Like, this isn't, we don't have the resources for it. It's that we're not prioritizing it. And if somebody's a school teacher and they need housing assistance, more power to them. They should be treated like a human being, and they should get that housing assistance, not by saying, okay, then we're going to kick 5 TANF family out of public housing, but by making sure that people have access to what it is they need.
I think you're muted, Eric.
I said I'll dispense with any closing comments because there's no better place to leave it. Thank you to the ABA for hosting this event, and the recording will be posted. It's gone into the chat. The link, all the materials and the links and other things will be posted there. People should feel free to reach out to myself. I can get you in touch with Paul or Sarah if you have questions to follow up with them. But yeah, thank you so much to all of our presenters, to the ABA, and to you, our audience, for listening in to this awesome conversation today.
And last thing I did, as a former commission member of the ABA Commission on Homelessness, it was very good to be with you all again today.